In the 21st century, monsters are real. That is not a metaphor. That is not the kind of statement that belongs in a fantasy novel or a late-night conversation about the nature of human cruelty. It is a fact. A documented, government-acknowledged, internationally recognized fact that has been part of daily life for long enough that most people alive today cannot remember a world where it was not true. Nobody knows exactly when the first zone appeared. The historical record is disputed in the way that the historical record of any catastrophic shift tends to be disputed, because the people living through the beginning of something do not always recognize it as a beginning. What is known is that approximately 40 years ago, in multiple locations across the world simultaneously, patches of terrain outside major cities began producing monsters. Not animals. Not natural predators that could be explained by existing biological frameworks. Monsters. Creatures that did not correspond to any species in the record, that ranged in size from roughly human scale to things large enough that the military's initial response had been to treat them as geological events before anyone got close enough to understand what they were actually looking at. The zone spread. Not infinitely. That was the thing that eventually allowed human civilization to stabilize rather than collapse entirely. The zones had boundaries. They expanded to a point and then held, as if whatever was generating them had reached a natural limit and stopped pushing further. The boundaries were not fixed permanently, they shifted, they tested, occasionally a zone would push and require a response, but the basic shape of the situation became manageable within a generation. What made it manageable was the hunters. People began manifesting abilities. Not everyone. Not randomly. A specific subset of the population, identifiable through a marking ceremony that the guild system eventually standardized into a formal process, turned out to carry the potential for abilities that corresponded directly to what the zones were producing. As if whatever had brought the monsters had also brought the means to fight them, distributed through the human population in a way that no one had designed and no one fully understood. The hunter system grew up around this reality. Guilds formed to organize the people with marks and abilities into a functional fighting force. Ranking systems developed to assess and categorize hunter capability. Government contracts were established to pay guilds for zone clearance and monster suppression. The whole apparatus became, within 20 years, a fully integrated part of modern society with its own economy, its own celebrity culture, its own online presence, its own politics, and its own deeply entrenched hierarchy that determined who got resources, who got recognition, and who got left behind. At the top of that hierarchy were the S-rank hunters. S-rank was the highest classification the guild system officially recognized. There were fewer than 300 S-rank hunters in the entire country. They were the people the online community followed obsessively, whose hunt footage was streamed live and accumulated millions of views, whose contracted partners were photographed and profiled and discussed in dedicated forums. An S-rank Hunters Guild contract was worth more than most people earned in a decade. Their ranking updates trended on social media. Their personal lives were documented by fan accounts. When they dissolved a contracted bond and filed a report about a partner, that report did not just sit in a guild database. It went public. It was discussed. It was taken as authoritative because S-rank was S-rank and the system had decided that S-rank testimony did not require much interrogation. At the bottom of that hierarchy was everyone else. The people who tested for marks and received them at ranks too low for established guilds to recruit. The people who had guardian forms that did not photograph well or perform in ways that generated viral content. The people who lived in the districts that the guild system's resource distribution did not reach, which corresponded almost exactly to the districts that the rest of the city's resource distribution did not reach either, because hierarchies tend to stack. The slums on the eastern edge of the city, where Kale had grown up and where Kale still lived, were full of people the hunter world had looked at once and moved on from. Kale Draven was 20 years old on the morning of his marking ceremony. He had taken the bus to the guild assessment center because he did not own a car and the assessment center was in the central district where everything the guild system considered important was located, and the central district was 40 minutes from the eastern slums by public transit if the bus was on time, which it usually was not. He arrived 7 minutes late and was processed into the waiting group without comment because late arrivals at the assessment center were common enough that the staff had a procedure for them. The marking ceremony was not what the online content made it look like. The streamed versions, the ones that S-rank hunters posted from their own ceremonies years after the fact or that the guild released for promotional purposes, were edited. They were lit correctly and the people in them were wearing clothes that photographed well, and the ceremony itself was presented with a drama that the actual event did not possess. The actual event was a room with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs and a guild assessment officer behind a desk with a tablet and a scanner that you held your wrist against while the system read your potential and assigned your mark. Kale sat in a plastic chair and waited. Around him were 40 or so other people at various stages of the process. Some of them were his age. Some were older, people who had delayed the ceremony for various reasons or who were doing a retest after an initial low result. Some of them were clearly from better districts than the eastern slums. You could tell by the quality of their clothes and the ease with which they occupied the space, the ease of people who were used to institutional environments being designed with them in mind. He watched them without appearing to watch them. He had been doing this his entire life. Reading rooms. Understanding the dynamics of spaces without announcing that he was doing it. It was a skill that developed naturally when you grew up in an environment where misreading a situation had immediate consequences and the margin for error was small. He had learned early that the most useful information in any room was usually not the information people were presenting deliberately. His name was called. He went to the desk and held his wrist against the scanner, and the assessment officer watched her tablet with the professionally neutral expression of someone who processed 40 of these a day and had learned not to project expectations onto any of them. The scanner ran. It took longer than it should have. The assessment officer looked at her tablet and then looked at the scanner and then looked at her tablet again and did something with the interface that suggested she was running a diagnostic rather than reading a result. Kale watched her face. She had the expression of someone who had encountered a discrepancy and was determining whether the discrepancy was a malfunction or a result before she said anything out loud. She said she was going to need to run it again. He held his wrist against the scanner a second time, the same pause. The same duration. The same quality of the system taking longer than the standard process required. She looked at her tablet for a moment and then she looked at him with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they are not sure how to frame. She said the scan had produced a mark. She said the mark was registering at F rank, the lowest classification in the system. She said F rank marks were rare not because the rank itself was rare but because the system typically either produced a mark at a rank high enough to be guild relevant or produced no mark at all, and F rank sat in a territory that the guild did not have a standard processing pathway for. She said she was going to complete the formal registration of the mark and that he would receive the official documentation by email and that the guild's low rank resource page had information about what options were available at his classification. She said all of this without unkindness. She was just telling him what the system had produced. He said he understood. She applied the mark formalization to his wrist. He felt it settle, a warmth that was brief and then present in a different way, not a sensation exactly but an awareness, something that had not been there before the scanner and was there now, sitting in his wrist like a compass needle that had just found its orientation. He went back to the plastic chair. Around him the ceremony continued. The person who had gone before him had received a B rank mark and was on his phone already, probably texting someone, and there was the quality about him of someone who had received news they had expected and were now moving quickly to act on it. The person after Kale received an A rank and the assessment officer's professionally neutral expression shifted by a small but visible degree, the specific shift of someone who has just processed something genuinely notable, and the person with the A rank mark sat back down with the slightly dazed quality of someone still processing what they had just been told. Kale sat with his F rank mark and felt the compass needle in his wrist. It was pointing somewhere. Not at the assessment center. Not at the central district. Not at any of the guild buildings whose addresses he had looked up in preparation for today in the way you look up information about places you might be going if things go a certain way. The compass needle was pointing in a direction that corresponded to nothing he had prepared for. East. Back toward the slums he had come from. He thought about this on the bus ride home. He sat in the back of the bus with his wrist resting on his knee and felt the pull of the mark and thought about what F rank actually meant in the context of the system he had just been registered in. F rank meant the guild was not going to contact him. F rank meant the resource page the assessment officer had mentioned was going to contain information about low-level certification programs and community monster watch volunteer networks and other things the guild offered as a gesture toward the people its primary system did not have use for. F rank meant that in the online hunter community, if anyone mentioned his mark at all, the conversation would be brief. The bus moved through the central district into the transitional neighborhoods and then into the eastern districts, and the quality of the streets changed the way it always changed when you moved from the center outward, the buildings getting older and closer together, the storefronts different, the people on the sidewalks moving with a different quality of purposefulness, the purposefulness of people who did not have the option of moving slowly. He got off at his stop and walked the 4 blocks to his building. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been constructed 40 years ago and maintained with the specific level of attention that buildings in this district received, which was enough to keep it standing and not enough to keep it from showing every year of its age. His apartment had 1 room and a kitchen that was separated from the living space by a counter rather than a wall and a window that looked out onto the alley between his building and the next one. He had lived here for 2 years, since aging out of the group home where he had spent most of his adolescence, and he had made it functional in the way that people make spaces functional when functionality is what is available and comfort is something you work toward rather than start with. He sat on the edge of his bed and opened his status on his phone. The Hunter Guild app was something every registered mark holder had. It displayed your official rank, your registered status, your guild affiliations if any, your field record if any. His displayed F rank, registered, no affiliations, no field record, mark formalized today. Below the standard display there was a notification from the guild's automated system welcoming him to the Hunter registry and providing a link to the low-rank resource page. He closed the app. He looked at his wrist. The mark was visible now that it had been formalized, a clean geometric pattern on the inside of his left wrist that the scanner had rendered in the standard guild marking style. Every hunter's mark looked slightly different, the geometry unique to the individual, and his had a quality to the pattern that he did not have enough experience with marks to interpret, but that looked, to his eye, more complex than he would have expected an F-rank mark to look. The compass needle was still pointing east. He checked the direction against his mental map of the eastern district. East from his building meant deeper into the slums, past the district boundary where the maintained streets gave way to the sections that the city's infrastructure budget had not reached in a decade. He knew those streets. He had grown up in that part of the district, had spent his childhood in a group home 3 blocks past the boundary, had the kind of familiarity with that area that comes from having navigated it for years without the option of navigating anywhere else. He put his jacket back on and left the apartment. The streets east of the district boundary had a different texture to them than the streets he lived on. Not dangerous in the simple cinematic way that outside observers sometimes described them. Complex in the way that places are complex when they have been under-resourced for long enough that the community inside them has developed its own systems for managing what the official systems do not provide. People knew each other here. Not always warmly. But the knowledge was real and the networks it produced were functional in ways that did not appear on any official map. The mark pulled him 4 blocks past the boundary and then south and then into a side street that he knew from childhood as the street where a woman named Harrow had run an informal food distribution out of her ground floor apartment every Thursday for 15 years until she died and her daughter continued it. The side street had the same quality it had always had, narrow and specific, the kind of street that existed for the people who lived on it rather than for anyone passing through. He stopped in front of a building midway down the street. The mark was not pulling anymore. It had arrived. He looked at the building. 5 stories. Same era as his own building, same quality of maintenance. Ground floor had a unit with the lights on despite it being midday, the curtains drawn in the specific way of someone who had arranged their living space to minimize how much of the outside could see in. He stood on the sidewalk and thought about what he was doing. He had an F-rank mark that the guild had no standard pathway for. The mark had pulled him 4 blocks past the district boundary to a specific building on a specific street. He did not know who was in that building, that he did not know what the mark had found or why it had found it here rather than in the central district where the guild's resources and the registered hunter population were concentrated. He knew that every instinct he had developed over 20 years of reading situations accurately was telling him that the pull of the mark was not a malfunction and was not random, and that whoever was behind the drawn curtains in the ground floor unit was someone the mark had found for a reason. He went to the ground floor unit and knocked. Nothing for a moment. Then a voice from inside, careful and controlled, asking who was there. He said his name. He said he had just come from the guild assessment center. He said he had received a mark today and the mark had brought him here, and he understood that was an unusual thing to say to someone through a closed door, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. Silence. He waited. The door opened. The woman standing in the doorway was in her mid-20s. She had the build of someone who had been doing serious physical training for years and the specific quality of someone who had been inside for a long time, not the softness of inactivity but the contained energy of someone who had been keeping themselves ready for something without knowing when or whether it was going to arrive. Her eyes when they found the mark on his wrist were the eyes of someone who recognized what they were looking at and were not sure yet what to do with the recognition. Her name was Sarah. He did not know that yet. He learned it in the next 30 seconds when she looked at him for a long moment with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to be very precise about what they opened their door to, and then she said her name the way people say their names when they are deciding whether the person they are saying it to is going to be worth the decision. He said it was good to meet her. She said she did not know yet if she agreed with that. She let him in. The apartment was small and extremely organized in the way of someone who had been managing a reduced space for long enough that the organization had become second nature. There was training equipment in the corner, a resistance setup that she had clearly built herself from available materials rather than purchased, and the walls had the specific quality of walls that had been looked at for a long time, doing the kind of thinking that does not require you to look at anything in particular. She told him to sit. He sat. She remained standing, which he understood correctly as a positioning choice rather than a social oversight. She was not going to sit across from a stranger she had just let into her apartment until she had a better read on what the stranger was. She said she knew what an F-rank mark looked like. She said she had spent enough time in the guild system to know the marking patterns by rank, and what was on his wrist was F-rank. She said she also knew that F-rank marks did not generally lead their holders anywhere with any precision, because F-rank marks did not generally have the signal strength to do what she was assuming his mark had just done. She said this in a way that told him she was not trying to diminish his mark. She was trying to understand the discrepancy between the rank and the behavior. He said he had been thinking about the same discrepancy on the bus ride home. She looked at him. She asked him what the guild had told him about the mark. He said the assessment officer had registered it at F rank and directed him to the low rank resource page. Sarah made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. The sound of someone who had received enough information from the guild system to have a very specific relationship with the things the guild told people. He asked her how she knew the guild system well enough to read marking patterns by rank. The quality of the room changed slightly. Not dramatically. But he felt it, the specific shift of a conversation arriving at something that the person across from you has been managing carefully and is now deciding whether to manage with you present or to set down. She said she had been in the guild system for 3 years. She said she had a guardian form. She said she had been contracted to a hunter for 8 months before the contract was dissolved. He waited. She said the hunter who dissolved the contract was S rank. She said his name was Vance Holt. He was one of the most followed hunters in the country, with 4.7 million people following his main account and an average of 600,000 views on his hunt stream footage. She said when he dissolved their contract he filed a report with the guild stating that her guardian form was unstable and a liability in field conditions, and that the dissolution was a safety decision. She said the report went public the same day it was filed because Vance Holt's publicist had sent it to 3 hunter media outlets before the guild had finished processing it. She said she had not been able to get a contract since. She said no hunter would touch her because the report was the first thing that came up when anyone searched her name in the guild database. She said she had not transformed in 14 months because every time she tried the guardian form destabilized and she could not hold it, and she did not know anymore whether the instability was real or whether she had just tried and failed enough times in the aftermath of everything that her own belief in the stability had collapsed along with everything else. She said all of this in a voice that was controlled and flat, in the specific way of someone who has told a story enough times in their own head that the telling of it out loud has been stripped of the acute emotional charge it originally carried. Not because the charge was gone. Because she had learned to separate the telling from the feeling as a survival mechanism. He listened to all of it. Then he said he wanted to show her something. He explained the site of origin. He told her what it was and what it did. He told her it was part of his mark's ability set and that he had not fully explored what it showed him yet because he had received the mark approximately 4 hours ago, but that it had been running passively since the formalization, and what it was showing him about her was something he thought she deserved to know. She asked him what it was showing him. He said it was showing him that her guardian form was not unstable. It was showing him that the instability she had experienced during her contracted period with Vance Holt was a compatibility problem, a resonance mismatch between his boost frequency and her guardian form's natural operating frequency. The two frequencies were wrong for each other. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally incompatible in a way that would have produced exactly the instability that got documented in the report, regardless of what she did or how hard she tried to hold the form. She had been trying to stabilize something that could not be stabilized within that particular bond because the bond itself was the source of the problem. She was very still. He said the guardian form was not broken. He said what the report called instability was the guardian form's response to being pushed through the wrong resonance channel. He said his mark's ability set was showing him what her guardian form actually was underneath the instability record, and what it was showing him was not something that matched the report's description. She asked him what it was showing him. He said he would rather show her than tell her. She looked at him for a long moment. He said he understood if she did not trust him. He said she had been given significant reasons not to trust people who showed up with claims about her guardian form. He said he was not going to push and he was not going to make the decision for her. He said the mark had brought him here and he believed there was a reason for that, and if she wanted to know what the reason was he was ready to show her, and if she did not he would leave and she could decide what to do with the conversation later or not at all. She looked at his wrist. She said she had felt something when she opened the door. Not in a dramatic way. In the specific quiet way of someone who has been without something for long enough that the return of a signal they stopped expecting lands more gently than loudly. She said the mark on his wrist had produced a resonance that she had felt in the way you feel temperature change, not a single moment but a gradual awareness that the air was different than it had been. She said she had not felt that since before the dissolution. He said he knew. She said she was going to need a moment. He said take whatever time she needed. She stood in her apartment for approximately 90 seconds without speaking. He did not fill the silence. He had learned a long time ago that silence was not a problem that needed solving. He let it be what it was and waited for her to come back from wherever she had gone in those 90 seconds. Then she said okay. He stood up. She asked him what she needed to do. He said nothing. He said the ability unlock was something he directed. She did not need to do anything except be willing. She said she was willing. He activated the ability unlock and directed it toward her the way he had directed the site of origin, with focus and intention, and he felt the function engage the way he had felt it engage before, a key finding a lock, a resistance, and then a give, and then something opening. Sarah's body responded before her face did. He saw it move through her from the outside, a visible shift starting in her chest and radiating outward, and then the guardian form began to emerge, and it did not emerge the way the reports described it, in fragments, in destabilized pieces that collapsed before they could fully form. It emerged completely. Continuously. In one unbroken progression from human to something else that was not human and was not the small failing thing the report had described and was not anything that Vance Holt's field footage showed, because Vance Holt's field footage had never shown her guardian form actually working. It worked now. The room was suddenly significantly smaller than it had been. Not because the walls had moved. Because what was in the room had changed in scale. The guardian form that filled the space was enormous relative to the apartment's dimensions, and it was stable, completely stable, with a coherence and a quality of presence that stability produced, the specific difference between a thing that is barely holding together and a thing that simply is. The site of origin completed its reading of her guardian form now that it was fully expressed. What it showed him made him understand why Vance Holt had written the report he had written. Her guardian form was not a liability. It was not unstable. It was not anything that the filed report had described. It was a classification that the site of origin was rendering at a level that Vance Holt's S-rank boost frequency had genuinely been unable to handle, not because there was something wrong with her but because there was something insufficient about the match. And Vance Holt was a man with 4.7 million followers and a publicist and a guild contract worth more than most people earned in a decade, and the option of making the insufficiency someone else's problem was available to him. And he had taken it. Sarah held the guardian form for 30 seconds. Then she transformed back. She was standing in her apartment in her ordinary clothes and she was shaking. Not from weakness. From the specific physiological response of something that has been suppressed for 14 months releasing all at once, the body processing the return of something it had been without for too long. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at him. She said one word. She said how. He said the mark. He said his mark's resonance was compatible with her guardian form in a way that Vance Holt's had not been, and that the compatibility was what allowed the ability unlock to work, and that what she had just experienced was not an exceptional event, it was what the guardian form had always been capable of, it was just what it looked like when it was operating within the right bond rather than fighting against the wrong one. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said his name. Not as a greeting. Not as an acknowledgement. In the specific way you say someone's name when you are testing whether it is going to be attached to something you can trust, turning it over, feeling the weight of it. Kale, she said. He said yes. She asked him what contracting with him meant. What it actually meant. Not the guild definition. The real definition. He told her honestly. He told her about the no-limit function. He told her about the 10 times feedback. He told her that the mark had already brought him here and the site of origin had already shown him what she was and the ability unlock had already demonstrated the compatibility, and all of that had happened before a contract existed. The contract was not the thing that made it real. It was the thing that made it permanent and structured and gave it a framework that could grow. She asked him what she had to gain from it beyond what had just happened. He said the instability record was the first thing that came up when anyone searched her name in the guild database. He said that record was not going to dispute itself. He said the only thing that disputed it was field performance that directly contradicted what the record stated, and the only way to produce field performance was to be in the field, and the only way to be in the field was to have an active contract. He said he was offering her an active contract. She said the guild would see an F-rank hunter contracting with a partner whose last filed report described her as a liability, and the guild would not respond to that with enthusiasm. He said he was not contracting with her for the guild's enthusiasm. He was contracting with her because the mark found her and the site of origin showed him what she was, and what she was had nothing to do with the report on file and everything to do with what he had just watched fill this apartment for 30 seconds. She was quiet for a moment. He said she did not have to decide today. She said she had been waiting 14 months for something that was not available to decide on. She said yes. The contract formed the way the mark had always suggested it would form, without ceremony, without the formal guild processing that standard contracts required, just the resonance between the mark and what she was clicking into alignment, a completion of something that the mark had known was there from the moment it found her. He felt it settle. The site of origin updated. Contract registered. Sarah. Guardian form classification rendered at the level he had seen when she fully expressed. Contract network status, 2, himself and Sarah. 10 times feedback active. Current power return from network, processing. He felt the feedback arrive. 10 times Sarah's base ability feeding into him through the contract. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a sudden overwhelming surge of power. In the way of something real and structural adding itself to what was already there, the way a foundation is built, one layer at a time, each layer making the next one possible. He looked at the mark on his wrist. It was pulling again. Not in the direction he had come from. Not back toward the Central District or the Assessment Center or any part of the Hunter world that had processed his F-rank result today and moved on. Somewhere else. The compass needle was finding its next heading, and he understood, standing in Sarah's apartment with the first contract settled and the first 10 times feedback running through him and the first record of what the mark could do established, that today was not the day of one arrival. It was the day of a beginning. He looked at Sarah. He said he needed to tell her something. She said she was listening. He said the mark was pulling again, and he did not know yet who it was pulling toward, but he knew from the last 4 hours that the pull was not random and the person it was going to find was not going to be someone the Hunter world had bothered to look for. He said he thought he was building something. He did not know the full shape of it yet. He knew the first piece of it was standing in front of him. He knew the mark had more to find and the network had more to grow, and what it was growing toward was something that was going to take time and work and the specific patience of people who had been told they were not enough for long enough that they had stopped expecting the world to correct itself. He said he was not promising her anything except that the record on file was wrong and he could prove it, and he was going to, and she was going to be there when that happened. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said she had been waiting 14 months for something worth doing. She said, "Let's go." Outside the apartment window the Eastern District moved through its afternoon the way it always did, indifferent and complex and full of people the Hunter world's hierarchy had assessed and dismissed and moved on from. Somewhere in those streets the mark was already pointing toward the next person it had found. Somewhere in the guild system Vance Holt's report was still the first result when anyone searched Sarah's name. Somewhere in the Central District the S-rank hunters whose decisions had built the record that Kale was going to dismantle were going about their days without any awareness that in a ground-floor apartment in the eastern slums an F-rank hunter with a mark the system had called defective had just established the first contract of a network that was going to become the thing none of them had prepared for. The beginning was quiet. It always was. The mark pulled east. Not further east, deeper into the slums beyond where Sarah's building sat. A different direction. Southeast, specifically, toward the part of the Eastern District that sat closest to the zone boundary, the stretch of city where the infrastructure thinned out not just because of neglect but because proximity to an active monster zone had a way of discouraging the kind of investment that kept neighborhoods functional. Buildings in that strip had been abandoned and reoccupied and abandoned again in cycles that followed the zone activity levels. When the zone was quiet people moved back. When it pushed, people left. The result was a neighborhood that had never been able to build the kind of stability that made ordinary life sustainable. Kale had grown up 3 blocks from that strip. He knew it the way you knew places you had navigated for survival rather than for pleasure, which was to say he knew it completely and without sentiment. He and Sarah walked. He had asked her if she wanted to come and she had said yes without taking long to consider it, in the way of someone who had been stationary for 14 months and was not interested in being stationary for 1 more hour than necessary. She had changed into different clothes and put her phone in her pocket and met him at the building's front door with the quality of someone who had been ready for a long time and had simply been waiting for something worth being ready for. They walked without talking much. He was aware of her beside him in the way that the contract made him aware of contracted people, not intrusively, not as a constant presence demanding attention, but as an additional signal running alongside his own, the way you become aware of a second voice in a room that you had not noticed until the moment you did and then could not unnotice. Her baseline state was reading through the contract bond as alert and contained with an undercurrent of something he did not have an exact word for. The closest word was recalibrating. She was recalibrating in real time, adjusting her understanding of her own situation to incorporate the last hour, and she was doing it with the efficiency of someone who had been managing significant information adjustments without support for long enough that the process was practiced. He respected the efficiency. He did not interrupt it. The mark pulled him to a building on the southeastern edge of the strip, closer to the zone boundary than most occupied buildings in this part of the district. The building was 6 stories and about 2/3 occupied based on the window evidence, the specific pattern of some windows lit and some dark and some covered in ways that suggested the coverage was functional rather than decorative. The ground floor had been commercial at some point, the ghost of a storefront visible in the shape of the windows, but whatever had been there was gone and the space was now being used for something that was not commercial. He could not tell what from the street. The mark had stopped pulling. It was here. He looked at the building and then he used the site of origin actively for the first time since leaving Sarah's apartment, directing it at the building rather than waiting for passive information to accumulate. The ability moved through the building the way it always moved, making information available, and he read what it showed him. Multiple people in the building with ability profiles. Most of them low rank, the kind of ranks that the guild had assessed and declined to develop. A few with marks that had been registered and then essentially abandoned by the system because F and E rank marks did not generate the kind of return on investment that the guild's resource allocation decisions were built around. The ground floor had the highest concentration of people and the site of origin was showing him that the ground floor space was being used as something communal, a gathering point of some kind, people moving through it rather than just occupying it. And on the 4th floor, in a unit facing the zone boundary, a signal that the site of origin was highlighting the way it had highlighted Sarah, a specific quality of attention that the ability directed toward people whose hidden capability was significantly above what their official classification suggested. He told Sarah he needed to go up to the 4th floor. She asked if she should come. He said yes. He said he had a feeling about how this conversation was going to go and he thought Sarah being present was going to matter. She did not ask him to explain the feeling. She had had enough experience with the gap between what the guild system said and what was actually true that she had a working relationship with the idea that information sometimes came in forms that could not be fully articulated in advance. They went into the building. The ground floor confirmed what the site of origin had shown him. It was a community space of some kind, informal, the kind of thing that existed in districts like this because the official community infrastructure had not been maintained and the people who lived here had built their own. There were maybe 20 people in the space, a mix of ages, and the activity had the texture of a combination of things happening at once, some people eating, some people talking in the specific way of people working through a problem together, a few people in one corner who appeared to be training, working through movement sequences in the limited floor space available with the focused economy of people who did not have access to proper facilities and had adapted. Several people looked at Cale and Sarah when they came in. Not with hostility. With the assessment of a community that had learned to read newcomers accurately because the cost of reading them wrong was real. He felt the assessment and did not resist it and did not perform anything in response to it. He just moved through the space with the same quality he always moved through spaces and let people draw their own conclusions from watching him do it. A man near the entrance, somewhere in his 40s, with the build of someone who had been serious about physical conditioning for a long time and had not stopped just because the circumstances around the conditioning had changed, stepped slightly into his path. Not blocking. Just present in a way that created a natural pause. He said he had not seen them here before. Cale said it was his first time in the building. He said he had a hunter's mark and the mark had brought him here and he was looking for someone on the 4th floor. The man looked at the mark on his wrist. Then he looked at Sarah. He said Sarah's name. Not as a question. As a recognition. He knew who she was. Sarah said yes. She said she had not been here before either. The man said he had followed what happened with Vance Holt's report when it came out. He said he had known people whose situations had been affected by the way the guild handled dissolved bonds and the public reporting process and he paid attention to those cases. He said he was sorry it had happened to her. Sarah said thank you in the way of someone who had received this kind of condolence enough times to have a practiced response that was genuine without being raw. The man looked at Cale again. He said his name was Darrow. He said the building was a place people in this district used when they needed somewhere to be that was not the street and was not the kind of institutional space that came with conditions attached. He said most of the people here had some kind of mark or ability that the guild system had processed and set aside. He said it was not an organized thing. It was just what happened when people with nowhere official to be ended up in the same place consistently enough that the place became a thing. Cale said he understood. He said the person his mark was pointing toward was on the 4th floor and he wanted to talk to them. He said he was not going to represent himself as anything other than what he was, which was someone with an F-rank mark that the guild had no pathway for that had brought him to this building for a reason he was still working out the full shape of. Darrow looked at him for a moment. Then he said the 4th floor had a few people who had been there a while. He said there was a young man up there who the guild had assessed twice and turned away twice and who had been in this building for about 8 months. He said the young man's name was Ren and he was 19 and he had an ability that the guild's assessment equipment had classified as insufficient for field deployment and he had been trying to figure out what to do with that information for the 8 months since the second assessment. The site of origin confirmed this without him needing to direct it. Ren. 19. Ability classification on file, E-rank physical enhancement, assessed as insufficient for solo field deployment, not recruited. Hidden ability reading, the system was showing him something underneath the E-rank classification that the guild's equipment had not reached, a secondary function layered beneath the surface ability that the standard assessment process was not calibrated to detect because the standard assessment process was looking for guardian form compatibility and combat output metrics and Ren's ability did not present through those channels. What Ren's ability actually was, fully expressed, was something the site of origin was rendering in a way that made Cale understand immediately why the mark had brought him here. He said thank you to Darrow and went up the stairs. The 4th floor hallway had the specific quality of upper floors in buildings like this one, quieter than the floors below, the sounds of the street more distant, the particular quality of a space that was removed enough from the communal activity below to feel separate from it without being isolated. He found the unit the site of origin was directing him toward and knocked. A voice from inside said one moment. Then the door opened. Ren was 19 and he looked it in the specific way of someone who had not yet fully arrived in the version of himself he was going to be but was clearly heading somewhere. He was not small. Not the build of someone who had been sedentary. The opposite, actually, the build of someone who had been training consistently and seriously with whatever was available, which in this building probably meant whatever Darrow had set up on the ground floor and whatever Ren had figured out on his own in his room. His eyes when they found the mark on Cale's wrist had a quality that Cale was beginning to recognize, not the recognition of someone who knew what they were looking at exactly, but the recognition of someone who felt something in response to it before they understood what the response was. Cale said his name and said he had an F-rank mark that had brought him to this building and specifically to this door. Ren looked at him. Then at Sarah. Then back at Cale. He said the guild had told him twice that his ability was not field relevant. Cale said he knew. Ren said he was not interested in being told a third time by someone with an F-rank mark that the system had not found a category for either. Cale said he was not here to tell him his ability was field relevant by the guild's definition. He said he was here because the mark had a different definition and by that definition Ren was exactly where the mark said he should be. Ren looked at the mark again. He said the guild's assessment equipment had run his ability twice and both times it had come back with the same result. E-rank physical enhancement, insufficient for field deployment. He said he had accepted the first result and trained harder and gone back for the second assessment believing that the training would show in the numbers and the second result had been the same as the first and the assessor had been kind about it but kind did not change the numbers. Cale said the guild's assessment equipment was looking for specific output signatures. He said Ren's ability did not present through those signatures. He said that was not a statement about the ability. It was a statement about the equipment's range. Ren said that was easy to say. Cale said he knew. He said he was going to show him rather than tell him. He activated the site of origin fully on Ren and directed the ability unlock toward the secondary function that was layered beneath the surface E rank classification, the thing the guild's equipment had not reached because it was not looking in the right direction. Ren felt it immediately. He could see it happen, the specific moment when the ability unlock made contact with something the person carrying it had not known was there, the involuntary physical response of a system activating that had been dormant. Ren's hand went to his chest, not in pain, in the gesture of someone feeling something internal shift. Then his ability fully expressed. The site of origin showed Kale the complete picture now that the secondary function was active. Ren's ability was not just E-rank physical enhancement. The surface classification was accurate as far as it went. But underneath it was a secondary function that the guild's equipment had missed entirely. A tactical analysis ability that processed field information in real time and produced strategic output at a speed and accuracy that no standard rank classification covered because it was not a combat ability and it was not a guardian form compatibility ability and the guild's assessment framework did not have a category for what it was. Ren could read a fight before it happened. Not precognition. Not anything mystical. A processing ability that took in environmental data, movement patterns, ability signatures, positional information, and produced analysis faster than conscious thought, the kind of ability that in a field context meant that every person fighting alongside Ren had access to strategic information about what was happening and what was about to happen in real time. The guild had assessed this as insufficient for field deployment because field deployment in the guild's framework meant individual combat output and Ren's ability did not produce individual combat output. It produced something the guild's framework did not value because the guild's framework was built around individual S-rank performance and individual S-rank performance did not need tactical analysis because S-rank hunters were strong enough that analysis was secondary to power. But in a guild built around a network. In a structure where multiple people were fighting together and the coordination between them was the source of their collective strength. In exactly that kind of guild, a real-time tactical analysis ability operating at the speed Ren's was capable of was not insufficient for field deployment. It was the thing that made field deployment work. Kale looked at Ren and told him what the site of origin had shown him. He told him all of it. The surface classification and why it was accurate but incomplete. The secondary function and what it actually was and what it actually did. The gap between what the guild's equipment had measured and what was actually there and why the gap existed. Ren listened to all of it without interrupting. When Kale finished, Ren was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had always been able to do that. The reading. He had not known it was a named function. He had not known it was anything except the way he processed situations, which had always been faster than other people around him seemed to process them and had always been more accurate, and he had always assumed that was just a personal quirk rather than an ability because the guild's equipment had never told him otherwise. Kale said it was not a personal quirk. Ren said if the guild had missed it twice then what good was it? Kale said it was not good for a guild built around individual S-rank performance. He said he was not building that kind of guild. Ren looked at him. He said Kale had an F-rank mark and no guild registration and had shown up at his door today with someone he did not recognize and a claim about a hidden ability function that the guild's equipment had missed twice. Kale said yes. That was an accurate summary. Ren said that was not a strong opening position. Kale said he agreed. He said strong opening positions were for people who had been given them. He said neither of them had been given one and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He said what he was offering was not a strong opening position. It was the actual ground they were standing on, which was not strong in the ways the guild measured strength, but was real in a way that the guild's assessment of both of them was not. Ren was quiet again. Sarah spoke for the first time since they had come upstairs. She said she had been contracted to an S-rank hunter for 8 months and he had filed a report saying her guardian form was unstable and the report had been public for 14 months and it was still the first thing that came up when anyone searched her name. She said Kale had shown up at her door today with an F-rank mark and had shown her that the instability was never hers. She said she was not telling him to trust Kale. She was telling him that the gap between what the guild's equipment measured and what was actually there was real because she had lived in that gap for 14 months and today was the first day someone had shown her the other side of it. Ren looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Kale. He said, what did contracting with someone whose mark the guild had no pathway for actually mean in practical terms? Kale explained the contract mechanic. He explained the no-limit function. He explained the 10 times feedback. He explained what it meant that Ren's tactical analysis ability would feed back into the network at 10 times its value not just to Kale but to every person in the network, meaning every contracted person would have access to Ren's real-time tactical output amplified through the contract bond in a way that would make their field coordination something the guild's framework had not accounted for. Ren processed this. He said so if he contracts with Kale his ability feeds into the network and the network amplifies it and everyone in the network benefits from what his ability produces. Kale said yes. Ren said and the network is currently 2 people. Kale said yes. Ren said that was a very small network. Kale said it was. He said it was going to be larger. He said the mark had more to find and the mark did not find things that were not there. Ren looked at the mark on Kale's wrist. He said he had spent 8 months on the 4th floor of this building trying to figure out what to do with the information that the guild had given him twice. He said he had trained every day because stopping felt like agreeing with the assessment and he was not ready to agree with the assessment but he also had not had a clear alternative to offer himself. He said this sounded like a clear alternative. He said yes. The contract formed between them the same way it had formed with Sarah, the resonance of the mark finding the ability and the ability finding the mark and the bond establishing itself in the specific way of 2 things that were always supposed to connect finally being in proximity to each other. Kale felt the second feedback arrive through the network. 10 times Ren's tactical analysis ability feeding into him alongside Sarah's guardian form feedback. The 2 signals were different in quality, different in what they contributed, but they layered without conflict, the way sounds in different registers occupy the same space without canceling each other out. The mark on his wrist shifted. Not dramatically. A change in the quality of the pull, the compass needle incorporating new information, the network having grown by 1 and the system processing what that meant for where it needed to go next. He became aware of something else through the expanded network. Ren's tactical analysis ability was running through the contract bond and it was doing what Ren had described, processing field information faster than conscious thought, and what it was currently processing was the building they were standing in. The ground floor. The people down there. The ability profiles the site of origin had shown him when they arrived. The analysis was showing him something he had registered as background information and had not yet fully examined. Darrow. He directed the site of origin toward the ground floor with the full active attention he had used on Ren and what it showed him about Darrow made him stop for a moment in the specific way of someone who has just received information that reorganizes what they thought they understood about a situation. Darrow had an ability on file. It had been registered 12 years ago when Darrow had been in his early 30s and had gone through the marking ceremony and received a mark that the guild at that time had assessed as C rank and recruited him into a mid-tier guild and he had worked in the hunter system for 3 years before his contract with his partner had ended, not dissolved by either of them deliberately but ended by the partner's decision to leave the hunter world entirely for reasons that were personal and documented and not controversial. The dissolution had been mutual and clean and Darrow's record showed no negative filings. But the site of origin was showing him something about Darrow's ability that the guild's records did not reflect. 12 years ago Darrow had been assessed at C rank. C rank was field relevant and the guild had recruited him on that basis. But C rank 12 years ago, without active contracts, without the kind of development that field work and contracted bonds produced, was not the same as C rank now. 12 years of training in this building, 12 years of developing his ability through the kind of work that did not show up in official records because it was not happening within the guild system, 12 years of someone who had not stopped just because the institutional context around him had ended. What the site of origin was showing him now was not C rank. It was not the same ability it had been 12 years ago either. It had changed. developed in a specific direction that the original assessment had not predicted because the original assessment was a snapshot and this was 12 years past that snapshot. The hidden reading, the layer the site of origin could always reach, was showing him something that the C rank label from 12 years ago did not come close to covering. He looked at Ren. He said he needed to go back downstairs. Ren said he would come. The three of them went back to the ground floor. Darrow was in the same position he had been in near the entrance, talking to two other people in the community space, but he registered their return and ended the conversation and came toward them with the patient quality of someone who was not surprised by the return. Kale looked at him directly. He said he wanted to be honest with Darrow about something. Darrow said go ahead. He said the site of origin had shown him Darrow's ability profile when they came in and he had not said anything about it at the time because he had been focused on reaching the 4th floor. He said what the ability was showing him about Darrow was not what the 12-year-old guild record described. Darrow looked at him steadily. He said he was aware the record was old. Kale said the record was not just old. He said the ability had developed in a direction the original assessment had not measured and what it had developed into was something that had field relevance at a level the original C rank classification did not reflect. Darrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had known the ability had changed. He said he had felt it change over the years, the specific awareness that something in him was different than it had been, capable in ways it had not been at the time of the original assessment. He said he had considered going back to the guild for a reassessment. He said he had not done it because going back to the guild as a 42-year-old man who had been out of the system for 12 years and asking for a reassessment was a thing he had not been able to make himself do. He said the guild was not a place he had left feeling good about the way it worked. Kale said he understood. He said he was not asking Darrow to go back to the guild. He said he was asking Darrow to contract with him directly and let the network show what his ability actually was in a field context rather than an assessment context. Darrow looked at him for a long moment. He said Kale was 19 years old with an F rank mark and no guild registration and he had come into this building today and in less than 2 hours had contracted with the woman the Hunter World's media had spent 14 months describing as a liability and a 19-year-old kid the guild had turned away twice and was now standing in front of him proposing a contract. Kale said yes. That was accurate. Darrow said he had spent 12 years watching the guild system operate and he had specific opinions about the way it operated and most of those opinions were not positive. Kale said he had not been in the guild system long enough to have 12 years of opinions but what he had seen in the past 5 hours was consistent with what Darrow was describing. Darrow made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an acknowledgement. He said he had a question first. Kale said go ahead. Darrow said the people in this building. The 20 or so people on the ground floor and the others in the units upstairs. Most of them had marks or abilities that the guild had assessed and not recruited. Some of them were younger, people who had received the assessment result recently and had not yet figured out what to do with it. Some of them had been here as long as Darrow had. He said he had been doing what he could to give people in this building something useful to do with what they had, the training on the ground floor, the community structure, the informal network of people who checked on each other and shared resources and made the space function. He said if he contracted with Kale he wanted to know what that meant for the people in this building. Not abstractly. Concretely. Kale said it meant the mark was going to find the ones it was supposed to find. He said it was not going to find everyone in the building. The mark found specific people for specific reasons and it did not pull toward people it was not compatible with. But the ones it found in this building, he was going to contract with them. And contracting with them meant they were in the network and the network meant resources and field access and the kind of growth that the guild system had decided they were not going to get and had been wrong about. He said the network was young and small and he was not going to make promises about what it would be in 5 years because he could not see 5 years from here. He could see what the mark was doing and what the site of origin was showing him and what the contracts that existed right now were already producing, and what those things were showing him was that what he was building was real and it was going to keep being real and it was going to grow. Darrow listened to all of this. Then he said he had one more question. He asked what Kale needed from him specifically. Not from the network in general. From him. Kale said he needed someone who knew how to run a structure. Someone who had been doing the work of organizing people and resources and making a community function in conditions that did not make it easy, and who had been doing it for long enough that the skill was real and not theoretical. He said he was 20 years old and he had a mark that the guild had no pathway for and an ability that could find people and unlock what they were and build a network that was going to become something significant. He said he did not know how to run a guild. He said Darrow had been running something for 12 years that had kept 20 people functional in the eastern slums without any institutional support, and that was exactly the knowledge he did not have and needed. Darrow looked at him. He said that was an honest answer. Kale said he tried to be honest about what he did not have as well as what he did. Darrow extended his wrist. He said yes. The third contract formed. Darrow's ability feeding into the network at 10 times its value, the feedback arriving in a way that was different from Sarah's and different from Ren's, a specific quality of accumulated experience and structural knowledge that the 10 times amplification made present in Kale in a way that was immediately useful, not as information he was downloading but as a kind of expanded capacity. The sense of knowing how to hold a larger structure because the network now included someone who had been holding one for 12 years. The mark pulled again. Different direction this time. Not the same southeast pull that had brought him to this building. Something new. And alongside it the awareness, running through the network now that Ren's tactical analysis was part of it, that the new direction was not in the Eastern District. It was in the Central District. He looked at Sarah. She read something in his expression. She said it was pointing toward the Central District. He said yes. She said the Central District was where the guild was. Where the S-rank hunters were. Where Vance Holt's office was. He said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the mark was not going to make this easy. He said he did not think it was designed to make it easy. He thought it was designed to make it right. He thought those were different things and he was prepared for the difference. Sarah looked at the mark on his wrist. Then she looked at Ren beside her and Darrow on the other side and the people on the ground floor of the building who were watching this exchange with the attention of people who understood that something was happening even if they could not yet see the full shape of it. She said okay. She said let's go to the Central District. Outside the building the zone boundary was visible in the distance, the shimmer of the active field that marked where the city ended and the monster zones began. Inside the building Darrow was already doing what he did, moving through the space with the efficiency of someone who knew how to prepare people for a change in conditions without creating panic, talking quietly to the people on the ground floor, answering questions with the patient authority of someone who had been trusted for 12 years and knew how to carry that trust without making it heavy. Kale stood on the sidewalk in front of the building and felt the network around him and the mark in his wrist and the pull of the next direction and thought about what it meant that 3 hours after being told he had a defective F-rank mark he was standing in the eastern slums with 3 contracted people whose abilities the system had underestimated and a pull toward the Central District where the people who ran the system that had underestimated all of them were currently going about there. Days without any awareness that something had changed, the network was 3 people and himself. It was going to be more. The mark did not pull toward things that were not there. He had learned that today and he was not going to forget it. He started walking toward the Central District. Sarah and Ren walked beside him. Behind them, in the building on the southeastern edge of the strip, Darrow finished what he was doing and came out and joined them on the sidewalk without being asked, the way someone joins a thing that they have already decided is theirs. 4 people. 1 mark. 1 network that the hunter world did not know existed yet. The Central District was 40 minutes away. They had a lot of ground to cover. The Central District was a different world. Not metaphorically. Practically. The streets were wider and cleaner and the buildings had the quality of structures that received the kind of maintenance that required significant budget and significant attention and got both consistently. The storefronts were the kind that existed for people who had money to spend rather than people who were managing without it. The people on the sidewalks moved with the specific ease of individuals who had never had to calculate whether the ground they were walking on was going to hold them up. Cale had been to the Central District before. Not often. Enough to know the texture of the place, the way it felt different from the Eastern District in ways that were not just about aesthetics but about the baseline assumptions the environment was built on. The Central District assumed access. It assumed that the people moving through it had the credentials and the standing and the resources to be there. It did not say this explicitly. It did not need to. It was in the architecture and the signage and the way the staff in every establishment positioned themselves relative to anyone coming through the door. The Guild's central office was 3 blocks from the main transit hub, in a building that had been designed to communicate institutional authority through its physical presence. Glass and steel and height, the specific combination that said this organization has been here and intends to stay here and has the resources to make that intention visible. The Guild logo was on the exterior in a size that required no searching to find. The entrance had automatic doors and a lobby with a reception desk and a security checkpoint and the kind of ambient lighting that made everyone inside it look like they were already performing for an assessment. Cale had not been planning to come to the Guild today. The Mark had not cared about his plans. He stopped on the sidewalk across the street from the Guild building and looked at it and felt the pull of the Mark resolving into something more specific than direction. Inside that building. Upper floors based on the quality of the signal, the way the pull had a vertical component that suggested elevation. Ren said quietly beside him that the signal was coming from the 6th floor, northeastern corner. Cale looked at him. Ren said he was processing the directional information through the tactical analysis and the specificity was available if Cale wanted it. Cale said that was useful. Ren said he was beginning to understand what the network actually meant in practical terms. Darrow looked at the Guild building and said nothing for a moment. Then he said he had not been in that building in 12 years and he was comfortable with that record remaining intact if there was an alternative. Cale said they were not going in through the front entrance. Darrow said he was glad to hear that. Sarah said she was not glad to hear that because it implied a less direct approach and she had been waiting 14 months to be less avoidant about things related to the Guild and she was not interested in extending that pattern. Cale said what he meant was that walking into the Guild's central office with 3 people whose ability profiles were not going to produce the kind of reception that made the conversation easy was not the most efficient first move. He said the Mark was pointing towards someone specific on the 6th floor and he wanted to understand who that person was before he walked into the building where their institutional context would shape everything about how the interaction went. He directed the site of origin toward the 6th floor northeastern corner of the Guild building from across the street. The ability reached across the distance with more effort than it required at close range, but it reached. The information it returned was partial, compressed by the distance and the building's materials, but enough to work with. The 6th floor of the Guild's central office was the administrative level. Not public-facing. Not the assessment floors or the contract registration floors or the hunt briefing rooms. The administrative level was where the Guild's internal operations ran, staffing, records management, the database systems that held every registered hunter's profile and every filed report and every official document the Guild had produced since its founding. People who worked on the 6th floor were not hunters. They were the institutional infrastructure that made the hunter system function, the people who processed and maintained and managed the records that determined how the hunter world understood itself. The person the Mark was pointing toward was on the 6th floor. The site of origin gave him what it could from the distance. A woman. Late 20s. Staff identification on file with the Guild, 3 years of employment in the records management division. Ability classification on file. Guardian form, assessed as permanently dormant following a dissolved contract, partner status inactive. Hunter World participation ended 2 years ago by her own withdrawal from the registered partner pool. He read the dormant classification and felt the site of origin doing what it always did when it encountered that specific kind of discrepancy, reaching past the surface classification toward what was actually there. The Guardian form was not dormant. It had never been dormant. The dormant classification had been applied following the dissolved contract and the circumstances of the dissolution, circumstances that the partial reading from across the street was not giving him enough detail to fully reconstruct but whose shape he could infer from the result. A guardian form that the guild classified as permanently dormant was a guardian form whose partner had been told, officially, that the ability was gone. Not suppressed. Not waiting. Gone. He could see it was not gone. Whatever had been done to produce that classification, whatever had happened in the dissolved contract that preceded it, the guardian form was present and real, and the site of origin was showing him the hidden reading beneath the dormant label with the same quality of attention it had given Sarah and Ren and every person the mark had found. He thought about what it meant to be told your ability was permanently gone and then go to work every day in the building where that declaration was on file. He thought about spending 3 years in the records management division of the guild system, surrounded by the documentation of other people's active abilities and field records and rank progressions, when the file with your name on it said your ability was permanently dormant. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with that thought. Then he said he needed to go in. Sarah said she was coming. He said yes. He said Sarah specifically needed to come because what he was about to do was going to be better understood in context, and Sarah was context. Ren said he would stay outside and maintain the tactical analysis feed through the network so Kale had situational awareness of the building's interior layout as they moved through it. Darrow said he was going to find coffee because he had been in the Eastern District since 6 in the morning and the Central District had better options, and he was not going to stand on a sidewalk watching a guild building when there was a cafe 30 meters to his left. Kale said that was fine. He and Sarah crossed the street and went into the guild building. The lobby received them the way the lobby was designed to receive anyone who came through the automatic doors, with the immediate assessment of the security checkpoint and the reception desk, a fast professional read of who was coming in and what their business was and whether their credentials matched the floor they were trying to access. The security officer at the checkpoint looked at Kale's guild registration on his phone, which showed F rank, registered today, no affiliations, no field record. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone trying to identify which category this fell into. Kale said he had a meeting request for the records management division on the 6th floor. He said it was regarding a filing discrepancy in a registered partner's record. The security officer looked at Sarah's registration. Her status was visible in the guild system, registered partner, dissolved contract on file, Vance Holt's report attached to her profile, partner status inactive. The security officer said the 6th floor was administrative and not generally accessible to non-staff. Kale said he understood that. He said the filing discrepancy he needed to address was in a partner record and partner records were managed on the 6th floor, and the discrepancy was significant enough that he had been advised to address it in person rather than through the online filing system. The security officer said who had advised him of that. Kale said the guild's own automated system had flagged the discrepancy and generated the advisory. He said he had the notification on his phone if the officer wanted to see it. He had no such notification. The guild's automated system had not flagged anything. But the statement was delivered with the specific quality of someone stating a fact they were confident in, and security officers at institutional checkpoints process dozens of people with dozens of stated purposes every day, and the path of least resistance was almost always to route the person to the floor they claimed they needed and let that floor's staff handle the situation. The officer said he would need to log the visit and that someone from the 6th floor would need to confirm the appointment. Kale said of course. The officer made a call. Kale watched his face during the call and listened to the half of the conversation that was audible. The person on the 6th floor who answered was apparently not the person the mark was pointing toward, was apparently a general staff member who handled visitor routing, and apparently confirmed that filing discrepancies in partner records could be addressed on the 6th floor and that someone would meet them at the elevator. The officer issued visitor passes and directed them to the elevators. The 6th floor had the specific quality of a working administrative environment, the kind of space that was organized entirely around function rather than impression. Rows of workstations, each one occupied by someone processing something on a screen, the ambient sound of a professional environment at steady productive capacity. The person who had come to meet them at the elevator was a young man in his mid-20s who introduced himself as a records coordinator and asked them to follow him to a consultation area near the back of the floor. As they moved through the workstations, Cale let the site of origin run and felt the marks pull, sharpening as they moved toward the northeastern corner. He saw her before the mark fully resolved. She was at a workstation in the northeastern section, facing a screen, with the posture of someone who had been in the same position for long enough that the position had become natural. She was not looking up. She was working with the focused efficiency of someone who had structured their relationship to their work around the work itself rather than around the environment surrounding it, the specific quality of someone who did not look around much because looking around meant seeing the things they had decided not to look at. The mark on his wrist was completely still. Not pulling anymore. Arrived. The records coordinator was directing them to a small consultation room with a table and chairs. Cale stopped walking. The coordinator noticed and stopped and looked at him. Cale looked at the woman at the workstation in the northeastern corner. He said he thought there had been a miscommunication about who he needed to speak with. He said the record in question was associated with a specific staff member who had processed it and he needed to speak to that person directly. The coordinator looked uncertain. Cale said he was not trying to cause difficulty. He said the record was sensitive and the person who processed it would understand the specific nature of the discrepancy better than a general consultation could address. The coordinator said he would need to check if the staff member was available for an unscheduled consultation. Cale said he would appreciate that. The coordinator went to the workstation in the northeastern corner and said something to the woman there. She looked up for the first time and looked across the floor toward Cale and Sarah, and her expression did a thing that expressions did when they encountered something that required rapid internal processing and the processing was not finished before the face was already being looked at. She looked at Sarah specifically. Not with recognition of Sarah as a person. With the recognition of someone who had processed enough records to know a profile when they saw the person attached to it. She had been in records management for 3 years. She had processed partner records for 3 years. Sarah's record was one of the most discussed partner records in the system in the past 14 months, and anyone in records management had seen it. She said something to the coordinator and the coordinator nodded and came back and said the staff member could speak with them briefly. Her name was Yael. She came to the consultation room and sat across from them, and she had the composed professional manner of someone who had learned to keep their personal relationship to their work separate from the face they presented in their work environment. She looked at Cale first and then at Sarah and then at the mark on Cale's wrist. She said she understood they had a question about a partner record. Cale said yes. He said the record in question was Sarah's and the discrepancy was the filed report from Vance Holt that described Sarah's guardian form as unstable and a liability. Yael said that report was an official filing from a registered S-rank hunter and was part of the permanent record. Cale said he knew. He said it was also inaccurate and he had the ability to demonstrate that inaccuracy, and he had come to the 6th floor of the Guild's central office to begin the process of having the record corrected. Yael looked at him. She said F-rank hunters did not generally come to the administrative floor of the Guild's central office to dispute S-rank filings. Cale said he agreed that was unusual. He said he was having an unusual day. Something moved in her expression. Not a smile. The shape of something that could become a smile under different conditions. She said the process for disputing an official filing required documentation, and the documentation requirements for disputing an S-rank filing were significantly more extensive than standard filing disputes. Cale said he had documentation. He said the site of origin could produce a reading of the bond residue in Sarah's system from the dissolved contract that would show the actual compatibility data from the contracted period, including the resonance mismatch that produced the instability documented in the report. He said this data directly contradicted the report's characterization of the instability as a partner deficiency rather than a compatibility issue. Yael was very still. He said he understood this was not the standard documentation the process referred to. He said his ability was not a standard ability. He said the documentation it produced was not something the Guild's record system currently had a framework for, and he was aware of that, and he was prepared to address the framework question separately from the substance question. Yael said the Guild's record system did not have a framework for ability-derived documentation in dispute filings. Kale said not yet. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said she had processed Sarah's record when the report was filed. She said she had processed it because it was her job to process it, and the report was an official filing from a registered S-rank hunter, and the record system had a process for that, and she had followed the process. She said she had not been asked to evaluate the content of the report. She had been asked to process it. She said she had processed it. Her voice on the last sentence had a quality to it that told him she had thought about that sentence before. Not today. Before. In the specific way you think about things you did because it was your job to do them when doing them required you not to look too closely at what you were doing. Kale said he knew. He said he was not here because of anything she had done, that he said he was here because the mark had brought him here, and the mark did not bring him to people without a reason. She looked at the mark on his wrist again, that he said the site of origin showed him things about people that standard assessment did not measure, that he said what it was showing him about her was not related to Sarah's record or the dispute filing or any of the official business he had described to the security officer downstairs. She said what was it showing her? He said her guardian form was not dormant. The consultation room was very quiet. Sarah looked at him and then at Yael. She had not known this was where the conversation was going. She understood it now. Yael's professional composure was still present, but it was doing more work than it had been doing 30 seconds ago. It was the composure of someone applying effort to maintain a surface while something underneath it was responding to what it had just heard in a way that effort alone could not fully contain. She said her guardian form had been classified as permanently dormant following the dissolution of her contract 2 years ago. She said the classification was in her official record. Kale said he knew. She said the assessment that produced the classification had been conducted by the Guild's own medical and ability evaluation team. Kale said he knew. She said she was telling him things he apparently already knew. He said yes. She said then what was he telling her? He said the Guild's assessment team had evaluated her guardian form 2 years ago following the dissolution of a contract and had classified it as permanently dormant. He said the site of origin was showing him that the dormant classification was not accurate. He said whatever had happened during that assessment, whatever the circumstances of the dissolution had been, the result on file did not match what was actually present. She said very quietly that the dissolution had not been mutual. He waited. She said the hunter she had been contracted with had filed for dissolution and the Guild had processed it, and as part of the dissolution processing a standard ability evaluation had been conducted to assess her guardian form status following the contract termination. She said the evaluation had found the guardian form to be in a significantly degraded state. She said the assessment team had classified it as permanently dormant based on the evaluation findings. She said she had not disputed the classification. He asked her why. She said because the hunter who had filed for dissolution was a rank and connected to people in the Guild's administrative structure, and she had been in the system long enough to understand what disputing an official classification looked like when the classification was supported by people with institutional standing and she was a partner with a dissolved bond and no remaining contractual standing. She said she had taken the staff position in records management because records management was what was available to her, and because being in the building meant she could see the records, and she had been looking for something in the records for 2 years, some discrepancy, some process error, some documentation inconsistency that would give her a foothold. She said she had not found one. Kale said that was because the error was not in the records. He said the records were accurate reflections of what the assessment team had found. He said the assessment team's finding was where the error was, and the error was not a process error, it was a reading error, the specific kind of reading error that happened when assessment equipment encountered an ability in a degraded state and could not distinguish between a temporary degradation and a permanent one. He said the guardian form was not permanently dormant. It was suppressed. It had been suppressed by the circumstances of the dissolution, and the 2 years of being told it was gone had not helped. But suppressed was not the same as gone. He said he could show her. She looked at him. She looked at Sarah. Sarah said she had been told her guardian form was unstable for 14 months. She said she had believed it for most of those 14 months because she had tried to transform and failed enough times that the failure had started to feel like confirmation. She said Kale had shown up at her door today with an F-rank mark and had shown her that the instability was never hers. She said she was not telling Yael what to decide. She was telling her what today had looked like from the inside. Yael looked at the mark on Kale's wrist. She said she had spent 2 years in this building looking at the records of people whose abilities the system had measured and classified, and she had spent 2 years knowing that her own record said permanently dormant, and she had spent 2 years not being able to prove that the record was wrong. She said if he was telling her the record was wrong, he needed to understand what it would mean for her to believe that and be wrong about believing it. He said he understood. He said he was not going to tell her it would not cost her something to believe it. He said if she let him show her and the showing confirmed what the site of origin was telling him, the dormant classification on her record was going to need to be addressed, and addressing it was going to require engaging with the guild system and the people in it who had produced the classification in the first place, and that was not going to be without friction. He said he was not offering her something easy. He was offering her something true. She said those were different things. He said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the consultation room had a privacy setting that was used for sensitive record discussions, and she could activate it and no one outside the room would be able to observe what was happening inside it. He said that worked. She activated the privacy setting. He directed the ability unlock toward her with the same focused intention he had used with Sarah and Ren, the key finding the lock, the resistance, and then the give, and something opening that had been closed for 2 years. Yael's response was different from Sarah's and different from Ren's. Not in the quality of the ability unlock. In what the unlock reached. 2 years of a guardian form being told it was gone was a different kind of suppression than 14 months of instability or a hidden secondary function that had simply never been detected. 2 years of absence was deeper. The unlock reached further for it, and when it found it the release was slower, more careful, the way you would open something that had been sealed for long enough that the opening needed to be gradual rather than sudden. The guardian form began to emerge. In the consultation room of the guild's administrative floor, in a space designed for the discussion of records and filing discrepancies, Yael's guardian form came back. It was not small. It was not the kind of ability that the permanently dormant classification suggested might have once been present in a reduced or marginal form. It was substantial and real and fully present, the specific quality of something that had been compressed for 2 years and was now having room given back to it and was expanding into that room completely. The site of origin completed its reading. What it showed him made him understand why the A-rank hunter who had filed for dissolution had been motivated to ensure the subsequent evaluation produced the result it produced. What Yael's guardian form actually was, fully expressed, was not something an A-rank hunter would have been able to direct effectively. The same compatibility problem that had affected Sarah's contracted period. The same dynamic of a hunter encountering an ability that exceeded what their rank could handle and choosing the available solution that protected their standing rather than the available solution that was honest. Yael was looking at her hands. The guardian form was holding. Stable. Present. The permanently dormant classification on her official record was in direct contradiction with what was in the consultation room at this moment. She said something very quietly. He asked her to say it again. She said she had been in this building for 3 years. She said she had processed hundreds of records. She said she had processed records for people whose situations were similar to hers, and she had processed them the way she had processed Sarah's record, because it was her job and the process was the process, and she had not looked too closely at the content because looking too closely at the content while the classification on her own record said permanently dormant was not something she had been able to do without it costing her more than she had available to spend. She said she was sorry. Sarah said she did not need to be sorry for doing her job. Yael said she was not sorry for doing her job. She was sorry for not looking more closely at the ones she should have looked more closely at. She said those were different things. The Guardian form settled back and she was herself again in the consultation room, and the privacy setting was still active, and outside the room the 6th floor of the Guild's central administrative office was continuing to function exactly as it had been functioning before the three of them had come through the elevator. Kale said he needed to tell her what the mark was. She said she was listening. He explained the full contract mechanic. The no-limit function. The 10 times feedback. The network and how it worked and what it meant for everyone inside it. He explained that the network currently had 3 people in it besides himself. He explained what contracting with him would mean for her ability, for her record, for her standing in relation to the Guild system and the classification on her file. She said contracting with him meant the permanently dormant classification was going to become impossible to sustain. He said yes. She said the people who had produced that classification were still in positions of institutional standing in this organization. He said yes. She said addressing that was going to be significantly more complicated than a standard filing dispute. He said yes. She said she had spent 2 years in this building looking for a foothold. He said yes. She said this was a foothold. He said it was more than a foothold. He said the site of origin had produced a complete reading of her Guardian form. The reading was documentation. The ability unlock had produced a demonstration. The demonstration was evidence. The contract would produce field performance. The field performance would be a record that he said records were her area of expertise, and she knew better than he did what a record that directly contradicted a classification on file meant for the classification. She looked at him for a long moment. She said she had one question. He said go ahead. She asked why he was doing this. Not the abstract answer about what the mark was and what it found, the real answer that he was 20 years old with an F-rank classification, and he had spent today in the eastern slums and was now on the 6th floor of the Guild's central office, and he had contracted with 3 people in a single day, and each of those people had a story that connected to the Hunter system's failures in specific ways. She said the mark explained the finding that IT did not explain the choosing. He could have received the mark and noted the discrepancy between its behavior and its rank classification and gone to the low-rank resource page like the Guild told him to and left it at that he had not done that. She said she wanted to know why that he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had grown up in the eastern slums in a group home with people who had been assessed by various systems as not worth significant investment, and the assessment had been wrong consistently, and the cost of the assessment being wrong had been paid by the people it was wrong about rather than by the systems that produced it. He said he was not interested in a world where the cost of the system being wrong was paid by the people the system was wrong about. He said the mark was finding people the system had been wrong about. He said the network was going to make the cost of that wrongness visible in a way that the system could not attribute to anything except the gap between what it had measured and what was actually there. He said that was why. She looked at him for what felt like a long time. Then she said yes. The 4th contract formed. He felt it arrive through the network alongside Sarah's and Ren's and Darrow's, a 4th signal with its own quality, the specific intelligence of someone who had spent 3 years inside the system that had wronged her, learning exactly how that system worked, feeding back into the network at 10 times its value. The mark on his wrist shifted again. He looked at it. It was pulling again already. For contracts in 1 day, and the mark was already pointing toward the next person it had found. Ren's tactical analysis feed through the network was processing the new direction, and the output was showing him that the direction was not in the central district. It was in the Hunter training complex on the western edge of the city. He looked at Sarah. She looked at the mark. She said it had been a long day and it was apparently not finished. He said apparently not. She said she had been stationary for 14 months. He said she had mentioned that. She said she was noting that stationary was no longer a problem she was experiencing. Yael stood up from the consultation table and looked around the consultation room with the expression of someone taking a last look at the context they were about to step out of. She had been in this building for 3 years. She had processed hundreds of records. She had the dormant classification on her file, and she had been looking for a foothold for 2 years. She had found one. She said she needed to submit a leave request before they left. Kale said take whatever time she needed. She said it would take 4 minutes. It took 3. They went back through the 6th floor toward the elevators, and Yael did not look at her workstation as they passed it, and the floor continued its steady administrative function around them exactly as it had before, completely unaware that one of the people who had spent 3 years processing its records had just contracted with an F-rank hunter whose mark the system had no pathway for and was walking out of the building to go somewhere the mark was pointing. In the lobby, the security officer logged their departure without particular interest. Outside on the sidewalk, Darrow was finishing a coffee and Ren was leaning against the building wall with his eyes slightly unfocused in the way of someone running a processing function that required most of their attention. He registered their return and straightened up and looked at the group that had come out of the building, which was larger than the group that had gone in. He said the Western Training Complex. Kale said yes. Ren said the tactical analysis was showing him that the complex had 3 active hunter training sessions currently running and 1 session that had been suspended pending a review of an incident that had occurred during a field simulation 2 days ago, and the suspended session involved a partner whose guardian form had done something during the simulation that the training supervisors had not been able to classify, and the classification question was currently sitting in the incident review. Q. He said the unclassifiable guardian form event was in training room 7 on the complex's 2nd level. Kale said that was specific. Ren said the network was expanding and the tactical analysis had more to work with each time a new contract formed. Darrow finished his coffee and looked at the group assembled on the sidewalk in front of the guild's central office. He said 5 people was starting to look like the beginning of something. Kale said it was. Darrow said the Western Training Complex was on the other side of the Central District and there was a transit line that ran directly there and the next departure was in 6 minutes. He said they should move. They moved. Behind them the guild building continued its institutional day. Inside it, on the 6th floor in the Records Management Division, Yael's workstation sat empty for the first time in 3 years, and the records it had processed were still in the system and the permanently dormant classification was still in the file with her name on it, and the report with Sarah's name on it was still the first result when anyone searched her profile. None of that had changed yet. But the person who knew exactly where those records were and exactly how the system that produced them worked and exactly what documentation would be needed to begin the process of changing them was on a transit platform with an F-rank hunter and a network that was 4 people and growing, and a mark that had not stopped pulling since the moment it was formalized. The records were going to change. It was going to take time and friction and the specific patience of people who had been waiting for longer than they should have had to wait. But it was going to happen. The transit arrived. They got on. The Western Training Complex was 12 minutes away and the mark on Kale's wrist was steady and certain and pointing the whole way there. The Western Training Complex looked nothing like the Guild's central office. Where the administrative building had been designed to communicate permanence and authority, the training complex was designed to communicate function. Low wide buildings arranged around a series of outdoor combat rings and indoor simulation halls, the specific architecture of a place built to produce results rather than impressions. Hunters in training gear moved between buildings in small clusters. Supervisors watched from elevated platforms with tablets in hand, tracking metrics that would eventually decide who got promoted and who got quietly filtered out of the pipeline entirely. Ren said Training Room 7 was on the 2nd level of the main simulation hall, and that the session inside it had been suspended for 2 days, which was unusual, because suspended sessions at this complex were normally resolved within hours. Kale asked what usually caused a 2-day suspension. Ren said the tactical analysis was only giving him the surface classification, which listed the reason as pending incident review, and the incident review category existed specifically for situations the training supervisors did not have a standard protocol for closing out quickly. Darrow said that sounded familiar. They went in through a side entrance Ren identified as underused during midday shift changes, and the 2nd level of the simulation hall had the same quiet, functional hum as the Guild's 6th floor had, people moving through their jobs with the specific unhurried focus of an environment that assumed no one watching was going to interrupt them. Training Room 7 was at the end of a corridor lined with observation windows into other rooms, sessions running behind glass, supervisors watching partners spar against simulated threats with clipboards and murmured notes. The window into Room 7 was covered. Not with a curtain. With an official notice taped directly to the glass, stating the room was closed pending review and unauthorized entry was a violation of complex policy. Cale directed the site of origin through the door. What it found inside matched what Wren's tactical read had already suggested and went further than it. A woman, mid-20s, sitting alone on a training mat with her knees drawn up, and beside her a supervisor's tablet resting on a bench, its screen still open to an incident report that had never been finalized. Her guild file, layered beneath the surface the way every file the Mark found was layered, showed a Guardian form assessment 2 days old, flagged first as combat capable at a level significant enough to warrant immediate S-rank track consideration, and then, 4 hours later, refiled as requiring further evaluation following an uncontrolled incident during simulation. The site of origin reached past both filings toward what had actually happened, and Cale understood in the same instant why the room was sealed and why the review had not closed in the normal few hours. Her name was Zara. She had been paired, 2 days ago, in a routine simulation exercise, against a senior instructor whose own contracted partner was already S-rank track and whose reputation at the complex rested on being difficult to beat in a training environment. Zara's Guardian form had responded to the simulated threat exactly as it was built to respond, at full output, and it had not merely matched the instructor's partner. It had outmatched it, decisively, in under 2 minutes, in front of an observation gallery of junior trainees who had all seen it happen. The instructor had ended the session immediately and personally filed the follow-up report describing the outcome as an uncontrolled incident requiring further evaluation, a phrase vague enough to justify sealing the room and suspending Zara's status without ever describing, on record, what had actually occurred. What had actually occurred was that a training complex built around ranking people by measurable output had produced someone whose output was inconvenient to measure honestly, because measuring it honestly would have meant acknowledging that a trainee 2 days into formal assessment had just outperformed an established instructor's own partner in full view of the people that instructor was responsible for training. Cale told this to Sarah and Darrow and ran in a few quiet sentences outside the sealed door, and then he knocked. Nothing for a moment. Then a voice, low and controlled, called through the door that the room was closed. Cale said he knew. He said he was not with the complex and was not part of the review, and he had a hunter's mark that had pulled him specifically to this room, and he understood that was an unusual thing to say through a sealed door and he was not going to pretend otherwise. Silence. Then the door opened. Zara was younger looking up close than the file had suggested, with the specific build of someone whose training showed in the economy of her movements rather than in obvious muscle, and her eyes went straight to the mark on his wrist with the same flicker of rapid, controlled recognition Cale had started to notice in everyone the mark had found, the look of someone encountering something that mattered before they had decided how to feel about it. She said the room was under review and she was not supposed to have visitors. Cale said he knew what the review said the incident was. He said he did not think that was what had actually happened, and he told her, briefly and directly, what the site of origin had shown him about the 2 filings and the 4 hours between them and the instructor whose reputation the second filing had quietly protected. Zara was very still. She said no one from the complex had said any of that to her directly. She said they had used the word uncontrolled and let her fill in the rest herself, and she had spent 2 days assuming the rest she was filling in was some flaw in her that the assessment had correctly caught, because that was easier to sit with than the alternative, which was that she had done exactly what she was supposed to do and the problem had never been her at all. She said she wanted to know which was true. Cale said he could show her, the same way he had shown 3 other people today, and it would not hurt and it would not perform for anyone outside the room, and whatever it found she would not be in a worse position afterward than she already was. She said to do it. The reading confirmed everything the site of origin had already surfaced from a distance, and when Cale told her all of it, plainly, Zara sat with it the way someone sits with a fact too large to react to immediately. She did not cry. She asked, in a voice gone flat and careful, whether the ability could actually prove any of this to someone other than the 2 of them. Kale said yes, and said proving it publicly was going to mean confronting an instructor with standing at this complex, and he was not going to pretend that was small. Zara said she had spent 2 days being made to doubt something she had known, in her own body, was true the moment it happened. She said she was done doubting it. The contract formed the way it had with the others, and Kale felt the fifth signal settle into the network, sharp and precise, a guardian form built for speed and exact control layering itself alongside Sarah's raw power and Yael's steady restored strength and Ren's tactical reach, the tenfold feedback compounding again into something that had, in the space of one afternoon, become genuinely difficult to categorize. They were still standing in the corridor outside room 7, the sealed door opened behind them, when Ren's voice changed, not the measured, steady tone he had used all day. Sharper. Immediate. He said the guild's automated zone monitoring system had just registered a spike on the eastern boundary. Threat level rising. Nearest response units requested to converge. Kale felt the mark on his wrist turn before his phone finished buzzing with the alert, away from the training complex entirely, east, back across the city toward the boundary nearest the slums, nearest Darrow's building, nearest everyone the mark had already found. Ren said the movement pattern was not diffuse the way ordinary boundary activity read. He said it had a center, one thing, moving with intention rather than drifting, and he did not like how directly it correlated with Darrow's building. Darrow's face changed. They ran for the transit line. The ride east felt longer than its 11 minutes. Kale sat with the mark warm and insistent against his wrist while Ren processed ahead of them in silence. Sarah sat with her hands deliberately open on her knees. Yael read guild response coordinates off her phone in a low steady voice, and Zara, still absorbing what had happened to her in the last 20 minutes, watched the transitional neighborhood slide by outside the window with the specific stillness of someone about to test, for the first time, whether what had just been proven true in a training corridor held up somewhere that mattered more. Yael said the guild's official response team, 3B rank hunters, was still assembling, projected arrival in 22 minutes. Ren said they would arrive in 6, if the train held. He said whatever had crossed the boundary already knew exactly where it was going. They got off 4 blocks early and ran the rest of the way, and heard it before they saw it, a low sound that moved through the ground more than the air, and then they came around the final corner and saw it. For stories of dense gray plating, moving with a patient, deliberate intention that told Kale immediately this was not a creature reacting to stimulus. It was executing something. Darrow was already in the street, alone, between the creature and his building's front door, 30 meters and closing. Kale said back up, now, and ran. Sarah reached him first. Her guardian form emerged fully in the open street, 14 months of doubt gone in an instant, and what came out was not unstable. It was exactly what the S-rank hunter's report had lied about, closing the last of the distance in 3 strides and putting itself squarely between Darrow and the creature. Ren's analysis arrived through the bond a half-second before the creature's forward limb came down, and Sarah was already clear of it, driving back into the exposed flank hard enough to stagger something 4 stories tall. Zara reached the street a beat behind her. Kale watched the last of her hesitation break, the same hesitation that had cost her 2 days of being told she had done something wrong when she had only ever done exactly what she was built to do, and then her guardian form moved through the space around the creature's legs with a precision built for exactly this, opening gaps Ren called out before they existed, folding seamlessly into a coordination between 2 guardian forms who had never fought side by side before but were operating through the network, as if they had. Yael came in third, 2 years of force dormancy releasing into a strike that intercepted a blow meant for Sarah, and the creature staggered again, recalibrating, for opponents where it had planned for one. Darrow, still at the entrance where Sarah had first placed him, said quietly that he had lived 3 blocks from this boundary his whole life and had never once seen anything retreat before it was forced to. The creature was retreating. Ren said its aggression pattern was shifting towards something more defensive, unusual this early in an engagement of this scale, and then his voice sharpened again, tracking a final desperate calculation the creature had made, correctly identifying the person at the center of everything coordinating against it. That it came for Kale. He had a second and a half. Ren was already calling the trajectory before Kale's own reflexes caught up, and he moved on the analysis rather than his instincts because the analysis was faster, and the strike passed through the space he had just vacated close enough to stir his jacket. And in that half-second, trusting a network he had built in less time than it took most people to finish a cup of coffee, Kale understood exactly what this fight had already proven, and exactly what it was about to cost the guild to keep pretending it hadn't seen. Because mounted on the corner of a building at the edge of the boundary street, an automated guild monitoring camera had been recording the entire engagement since the moment the creature crossed the threshold, the same monitoring feed that fed every zone breach directly into the guild's public incident archive as a matter of standard protocol. In 6 minutes, when the official B-rank response team finally arrived at a fight that was already over, they were going to find an F-rank hunter and 4 women the official record had spent months and years quietly discarding, standing over a creature they had driven back without a single registered guild unit present for any of it. The footage was already uploading. The official B-rank response team arrived 6 minutes after the creature had already retreated across the boundary, and found 4 women and an F-rank hunter standing in a street that had a cratered section of pavement and a scorch pattern across the nearest building's lower wall and nothing else to suggest that anything had happened here at all except the word of the people standing in it. The team lead, a woman in her 30s with the specific brisk efficiency of someone who had run boundary responses for years, looked at the scene and then at Kale's registration on her scanner, F-rank, no affiliations, and then at the 4 Guardian forms settling back into their partners beside him, none of whom the guild's active partner registry currently listed as field cleared. She asked what had happened here. Kale told her, plainly. Zone breach, a single large threat moving with intent toward an occupied residential building, no official unit in range in time, so they had engaged it themselves and driven it back across the boundary before it reached the building. She asked who had authorized the engagement. Kale said no one had, because no one had been available to ask, and the alternative to engaging without authorization had been a building full of unaffiliated civilians facing a 4-story threat alone. The team lead was quiet for a moment. Then she said unauthorized field engagement by unregistered partners was a serious violation of guild protocol regardless of outcome, and she would need to file a full incident report, and all 4 women would need to submit to formal assessment before their status could be clarified. Sarah said she had already been assessed once by this system and the assessment had been wrong for 14 months. The team lead said that was not the point of this conversation. Kale said he understood the protocol concern, and he was not asking her to set it aside. He said he was asking her to look at the footage before she decided what kind of incident this had been, because the footage already existed. The guild's own monitoring camera had captured the entire engagement from the moment the creature crossed the threshold, and it would show her exactly what 4 unregistered partners had done in the 6 minutes before her team arrived. The team lead's expression shifted, the specific recalibration of someone remembering that a camera had been running the whole time and that whatever she decided to write in her report was going to exist alongside footage that either supported it or didn't. She said she would review the footage before filing. She did not know, standing in that street, that she was already several minutes too late to control what happened to it. The guild's automated incident archive uploaded raw zone footage to an internal review queue as a matter of routine, a process that had run without incident for years because internal review queues were, by design, internal. Supposed to produce. The clip went up with a caption that asked, simply, what an F-rank hunter was doing in footage like this. It had 11,000 views in the first hour. By the time Kale and the others had finished the on-scene questioning and were walking back toward the transit line, the clip had cleared 200,000, and the comment threads underneath it had stopped being confused and started being specific. People were pulling frame captures of Sarah's Guardian form and running them against her public record, the one still headlined by Vance Holt's report calling her unstable and a liability, and the frame captures did not look unstable. They looked controlled and enormous and precisely directed. People were doing the same with Yael, cross-referencing an inactive partner status against a Guardian form that had just intercepted a blow meant to level a building. People were asking, in threads that were growing faster than the guild's own communications office could staff a response to, how many other partner records the guild had gotten wrong, and how many of them had just been standing in that street. Zara saw it first, on her phone, in the transit car heading back into the Eastern District. She had spent 18 months managing exactly this kind of content cycle from the other side, and she recognized the shape of it before anyone else in the car did, the specific velocity of a story that had crossed from niche interest into something an algorithm had decided to feed to people who had never followed hunter content in their lives. She said this was not going to stay small. Ren said the tactical analysis agreed, though he admitted this was the first time he had ever applied it to something that was not a physical threat. Darrow looked at the numbers on Zara's screen and said he had lived in the Eastern District his entire life and had never once seen anything from this side of the boundary get looked at by this many people for a reason that was not pity or spectacle. He said this looked like neither. By the time they reached Darrow's building, the ground floor community space had already heard someone's phone catching the clip before Kale had said a word, and the 20 or so people who used the space looked at him with an expression that had shifted in the space of an hour from cautious assessment to something closer to recognition. The specific quality of people watching someone they had quietly wondered about turned out to be exactly what the mark on his wrist had suggested he might be. Kale did not have a plan for what came next. He had contracted 5 people in one day, driven back a zone threat that should have required a full team, and now had a clip with, by the time he checked his own phone standing in the community space, just under 1.1 million views, climbing in a way that showed no sign of slowing. The Guild's official communications office had not yet issued a statement. Vance Holt had. His account posted a brief, carefully worded response 2 hours after the footage went public, expressing measured concern about unregistered field engagement and the risks of encouraging unqualified individuals to enter zone conflicts without proper guild oversight, a statement that did not mention Sarah by name but did not need to, given that her record and his report were the first thing anyone searching either of their names would find sitting side by side. The response backfired within the hour. Because the same audience that had spent the afternoon comparing frame captures of Sarah's Guardian form against his old report describing it as unstable had also, by then, found the footage of tonight's engagement, and the two did not agree with each other in any way that reflected well on the report. Comments under his statement began asking, with increasing specificity, whether he wanted to explain the discrepancy. Kale read all of this standing in the community space with his phone in his hand, and felt the mark on his wrist pulse once, unmistakably, in a direction he had not felt it point before. Not east, toward someone the world had discarded. Toward the Guild's own communications office, downtown, where someone was very likely, at this exact moment, staring at a rapidly growing crisis and trying to decide how to respond to a story the Guild had never planned for and did not yet understand it was already losing control of. Ren's voice came through the network, quiet, careful. He said the tactical analysis was picking something up that was not a threat signature in the usual sense, but it registered anyway, sharp and specific, the way the mark's pulls always registered once he learned to recognize them. He said someone inside the Guild's own communications office was about to make a decision in the next few hours that was going to matter enormously to all of them, and the mark, for the first time since it had woken that morning, was pointing directly at the institution itself rather than at any single person standing inside it. Kale looked at the number on his phone. 1.4 million, and rising. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Anime Void for more amazing anime and manhwa recaps. What did you think about this video? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions. Want to see what happens next? Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next part.